Hey, Gus. I know that you're recovering from your surgery right now, and I thought it would be nice to get you a book on tape. From when I was younger, I remember you were interested in a book called Mafia Princess by Antoinette Giancana. I tried to find that as a book on tape, but it turns out it's not available anywhere, even older editions that I couldn't find. So I thought maybe it would be okay if I bought the book and read it to you. We'll go through it together and see what you think. Um, anyway, we'll start right in on chapter one, the Havana Connection. And this is to the director of the FBI. It says the first 7 lines blanked out. Castro and Cuba were discussed. Subject said that Castro was to be done away with very shortly, identity censored, registered doubt about this happening. Then Giancana assured them it was to occur in November and that he has met with the assassin on 3 occasions. The term blanked out. Assassin was the term used by Giancana. Giancana said that he last met with the assassin on a boat docked at the Fontainebleau Hotel, Miami Beach, Florida, and that everything has been perfected for the killing of Castro. Giancana said that the assassin has arranged with a girl, not further described, to drop a pill in the drink or some food of Castro's. Giancana also told, identity censored, that Castro is in advanced stages of syphilis and is not completely rational. 2 additional lines were blanked out. This was sent to the director on October 18th, 1960. This is where it really begins. There was not even the slightest resemblance between the suntanned, balding, middle-aged man who twisted nervously in his chair in front of me and the media stereotype of a gravel-voiced mafia godfather. In fact, I can't think of anyone who looked less like the public's conception of a mafia boss than my father in May of 1961. There was no paunch on his lean, 5'10" frame, thanks largely to the special diet of broiled steak with lemon juice and tomatoes that he followed religiously when his weight began edging modestly above the 160-pound mark. He didn't speak in broken Italian, and muscle-bound killers didn't enter a room kissing his ring or hugging him while mumbling words of respect in his ear. At 52, Sam Mooney Giancana, the Chicago Mafia's successor to Prohibition gangster boss Al Capone, was more interested in maintaining youthful appearance than in presenting a movie image of a mafioso. Sam worked at looking young, and except for his balding head and graying hairline, he usually succeeded. He wore a carefully constructed, lifelike toupee that cost him more than $1,000. When he wore it, it made him look 10 years younger. My father liked that. He liked looking younger. He liked feeling younger. Above all, he liked proving he was young with those so-called glamour queens whom he succeeded in betting from Los Angeles to New York. Of course, all that female chasing had its disadvantages, too. It drew agents of the FBI around him like flies, and all those agents made his job in Chicago's most powerful and influential hoodlum that much more difficult. It was on a bright, sunshiny May afternoon in 1961 when I recall walking into his cellar conference room. It had once been my home at 1147 South Winona Avenue, Oak Park, Illinois. While I knew my father was under surveillance by the FBI and other agencies, I had not the slightest idea that he had been plotting with the CIA and various hoodlum friends, including Florida's notorious Santos Traficante, to assassinate Fidel Castro. Sam had almost a collegiate look to him as he leaned back in his high-backed, half-wing Romweber chair. His sharply creased blue slacks matched his tailored light blue open-neck sport shirt perfectly. Glistening from his belt line were golden initials SMG attached to a solid gold keychain that disappeared inside his right-hand pants pocket. On his left wrist was a thin rectangular gold watch with diamond-chipped numerals, and between his fingers he held a gold swizzle stick given him by his mother to stir his drink with. A slipper dangled precariously from his left foot. He acknowledged my presence with a frown. I remember vividly feeling a chill course its way up my spine as he flicked an imaginary speck from his slacks with his cold, piercing brown eyes looking at me as if they were x-raying my mind. I kissed Sam lightly on the cheek and sat down directly across from him in a chair identical to his in this, his very private conference room. It was a soundproof room where some of the nation's most notorious and powerful crime leaders had often gathered and changed the course of events in the glittering casinos of Las Vegas, or on the bustling streets of New York, or on the floodlit sets of Hollywood's movie studios. For as long as I could remember, there was a Jekyll and Hyde quality to my father's character, and I often wondered how he managed to mash such a dual life. When I was a small child, Sam had cuddled me in his arms, bounced me on his knee, and spent hours decorating our Christmas trees and putting toys together for me. And as he did those things, those loving and thoughtful acts, he was also deciding whether men should live or die on the streets of Chicago. Here in this room, dressed in casual attire, relaxing before me, was a man who struck chilling fear down the streets of Cicero, Illinois, to the cocktail lounges of Chicago and the sun-baked beaches of the Caribbean. Sam was a man who could be as graceful as a gazelle, whether walking across the street with his shoulders pulled back and his head held high, or lifting steaming strands of spaghetti from a platter with an almost maestro-like movement of his arms and hands. Yet when charged with anger, his eyes would flash with fury and his natural grace would give way to the violent, almost animal-like action and brutality of Chicago's underworld jungle, where men were tortured while hanging on meat hooks in a warehouse or gunned down on the steps of a courthouse. The newspapers, television, the FBI, the Chicago police, all at one time or another described my father as the most powerful and fearsome godfather west of New York from the day he ascended the Chicago Mafia throne of leadership until perhaps a year or two before he was assassinated in 1975 in the very cellar he and I were sitting in that day in May 1961. My father was a man who had learned the arts of murder and terror first as a member of the neighborhood ghetto gang in an immigrant area in Chicago known as the Patch, and had refined later working for and with the violent thugs Chicago spawned during the days of Prohibition. Sam had been closely allied with members of the infamous Al Capone gang, first through his youthful friendship with Vincenzo de Mora, better known as the Chicago press as Jack McGurn, Capone's most feared machine gun-toting assassin. And as my father grew in stature, he worked for many of Capone's successors, including Frank Nitti, Paul DeLucia, better known as in Mafia and police circles as Paul the Waiter Rica, and Anthony Joe Batters Accardo. Sam learned his trade so well that he followed in their footsteps to the top of the criminal ladder. My father had always prided himself on his ability to handle a car, to take the wheel and with the deftness of an experienced Indianapolis 500 racing driver, make it do tricks at dangerously high speeds. I can recall riding with Sam and hearing him almost scream at laughter as he wheeled around corners, rubber burning and brakes screeching, to shake a tail of federal agents or local police. Sometimes, after he eluded them, he would race up a side street and down another until he came up behind his confused pursuers, honking his horn with obvious delight as he peeled off down another street to lead them on another wild chase, laughing all the time. The almost fiendish delight with which he engaged law enforcement officials in such chases was the result of a craft he had learned as a youth as a wheelman, a driver, for young killers, and had fine-tuned while acting as chauffeur for Paul Rica and Anthony Accardo when they led the remnants of the old Capone mob. But that was in the past, and now as we sat together in the privacy of his conference room, Sam was the constant target of surveillances by the FBI, by the Chicago police, by law enforcement agents from one end of the country to the other. No matter where he went, whether to Florida, the Bahamas, the Caribbean, or Mexico, Sam was always watched. He had no privacy on the street or even in a bedroom with a woman, and the tension that such a lack of privacy produced was showing now as we sat together. He looked tired and drawn, and there was an edge of irritation to his voice as we talked. "Why don't you just quit, Dad?" I asked. "You've got all the money you'll ever need. Is it worth all this running, being followed constantly, harassed wherever you go?" His eyes narrowed as he glared at me. He put down the glass of juice he was drinking down on a tray and wagged a finger at me. "For Christ's sake, Annette, what the hell do you know about anything?" he snapped. "You don't understand. Mind your business. What I do is none of your business." I didn't understand. He was right about that. I knew nothing about the Mafia, or the outfit, as it's called in Chicago, except what I had read in the newspapers, and I had been told since childhood that newspapers never told the truth, particularly when they referred to Sam's activities. The only things I really knew were things I sensed or saw when I was in the presence of some of the underworld figures who worked for Sam, or when I was around entertainers who bowed and scraped and fell all over themselves to please him. So I suppose when I opened my mouth and suggested that my father quit as a boss, I sounded like a fool. It never dawned on me that the only way Sam could quit was to die. Sam fell silent again, staring off into some space behind me, withdrawing into that world I was seldom able to penetrate and almost never able to discuss with him. That other world of violence and secret conferences and international trade was never shared with me, my sisters, Francine and Bonnie, or even my mother. I changed the subject and decided to talk to him about a newspaper story I had just read about Castro in Cuba. The story was about the Bay of Pigs invasion disaster and about President John F. Kennedy's role in it. For a month, newspapers, radio, and television had devoted huge amounts of space and time describing this April 17th invasion by American-trained Cuban exiles. There were stories about the Central Intelligence Agency and about Havana hotels and their casinos that were no longer run by criminals like my father. I knew Sam had made many trips to Cuba, and naively, I wanted to share some information I had learned and at the same time find out how what had happened in Cuba had affected some of his investments and other business opportunities I had heard he was planning. On many occasions when I was in Florida, either with my mother, with Sam, or with friends, Sam would leave our summer home or the hotel where he was staying, like the Fontainebleau, or make a quick trip to Cuba. At times, he would be with other men when he made those trips. One of those men was Johnny Roselli, a rather handsome, polite, and soft-spoken man who was murdered after my father was killed. Roselli had testified before a U.S. Senate committee investigating assassination plots of international leaders by the CIA. My father, I learned later, was scheduled to testify before the committee, then headed by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, just before he was murdered in 1975. I've always felt very strongly that the subpoena requiring Sam to appear before that committee was the death warrant that led to his murder. But now as I talked to Sam, I knew nothing about international plots, the CIA, or how they might relate to Sam. In truth, it would have been incomprehensible to me that they would work for or deal with anyone in government unless he had bought and paid for them, and I had no way of knowing how deep a hatred he held for Castro, which was a subject he had never discussed with anyone in our family. What I knew came from what I had overheard when Sam talked to some of his friends, or when some of his friends would make casual remarks to me. One such casual remark concerned Sam's investments in ship boat business that both he and Anthony Accardo had in Cuba and in Mexico. They were large businesses, and I suspect Sam and Accardo had several $1 million invested in them, although I could never attach a reliable price tag to the overall business when I was researching my father's estate assets following his death. Not even the FBI or the Internal Revenue Service were able to establish how much money was involved, but the records suggest it was considerable and well hidden behind corporate fronts. You know, Dad, I said, I have an article here that you might be interested in. It's about Cuba and how a lot of people have investments there that they may lose. Sam's head snapped up from a magazine he had begun looking at. I had his interest now, his real interest, for the first time since I'd entered the room. Sam had a habit of ignoring things I had to say. He ignored or patronized most women except my mother in serious discussions. It was an irritating habit, one that stirred an often reckless abandon on my part to force him to pay attention to me or help me feel that I was somebody, not a machine to be turned on and off at his whim. His face colored slightly as his eyes focused on the article I held in my hand. I began reading excerpts from the article to him. They concerned Meyer Lansky, a Jewish figure in an organized crime whom my father knew quite well, and casinos that Lansky and other so-called organized crime people had investments in. Although the article didn't name my father, he was one of those who held a considerable interest in Havana's once popular casinos. The article didn't mention Sam's shrimp boat businesses, but I did. Didn't you and Accardo have a big shrimp business in Cuba? I asked. As Sam stared at me, I had the sense that if looks could kill, I would have been dead on the spot. I clearly remember noticing that the knuckles of his hands were almost white from gripping the arms of the chair so tightly. How many times you got to be told, he snapped. You never talk about my business. You don't speak about my friends and what we do. You understand? Keep your mouth shut about things you don't understand. I understood all right. Business. Family business of the mob was not a subject for discussions within our family. It was forbidden, a real no-no. The subject was there, and yet it wasn't. What he really meant, but never said, was that if my sisters and I knew too much about his business affairs, we could be subpoenaed and sent to jail if we didn't talk. Worse, we could be hurt, or Sam himself, despite his power of a boss, could be embarrassed, hurt, or even eliminated if the information we had could seriously affect the mob and its investments. One of those capable of taking such violent actions was Anthony Accardo. Accardo was a man of immense power and influence in Chicago's underworld. He had once been a bodyguard and an enforcer for Al Capone, and Sam had been Accardo's driver during the violent heyday of Prohibition and illegal booze. When Accardo stepped down as boss and went into semi-retirement, my father moved up as operating boss of the crime family. But even in retirement, Accardo maintained an influence on Sam and the crime family and received a considerable return on investments he had made while running the Chicago mob. One of those investments was in the shrimp business with Sam. I recall that Sam and Accardo frequently traveled to Florida, sometimes taking their families with them, and then left Florida's sunny beaches and so-called fishing trips to Bimini and other parts of the Caribbean. I know that Accardo was an avid fisherman and that he loved to catch marlin and tuna, but I never really believed that all the trips they made together from Florida or to Mexico were for fishing. Accardo was not a particularly lovable man. He has a certain amount of polish when he decides to display it, but it isn't the old-school European polish that others, like the late Paul the Waiter Ricca, exuded. Basically, Accardo was a rather simple and often crude and cheap individual. He used to hold an annual 4th of July bash for Chicago's mob at his home. At one such barbecue I attended with my father, I made the mistake of taking a dip in his pool and leaving the pool door open. "Hey, you," he shouted across the room, knowing full well what my name was. "You live in a barn? Shut the damn pool door." I could have died right there. My father was standing next to him. Nearby was Ricca, once Capone's right arm. My mother and a dozen or more other godfathers with their wives and children stood with him, and I was being singled out by this mafioso for committing the cardinal sin of leaving open the door to the pool. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. Somehow I kept my cool, dried myself off, and casually closed the door, looking right at him with my eyes telling him to go straight to hell. I never said a word, just turned on my heel and left the presence of the Great One to change. As I left the room, I noticed a sort of wry grin on my father's face. I was never certain whether he was grinning because I had been chewed out or because I had shown presence in the face of Accardo and given him a mafia look that he understood, a look I suppose I had inherited from my father, whose eyes would narrow and chill you to the bone when he felt the need to do so. The press and some members of the mob who came to my father's home often referred to Accardo as Joe Batters or Big Tuna. I didn't know how he got those nicknames, but I've often been amused by the fact that my father's friends who talked about Joe Batters among themselves were very careful to call him Mr. Accardo, or if they were on a higher perch in the pecking order of the mob, to address him as Tony when in his presence. There was always a lot of chit-chat about him when he wasn't around, but when he was present, they fell over themselves, bowing and scraping and practically licking his boots. All but Sam. He stood as an equal with Accardo and any of the other former Capone mob members who had reached the higher echelons of Chicago's underworld. Accardo might have looked down on others, made them feel subordinate, but he never acted superior in the presence of my father or in the presence of Paul Ricca. Ricca had been a boss of the mob after Capone's death and the suicide of Frank Nitti. I still don't know many of the details of Sam and Accardo's shrimp business. I did know that they both had put a lot of money into it. They had a large number of boats and processing plants in Cuba and Mexico, and it had been a very profitable venture in Cuba until Castro came to power. Then it was seized, like so many other businesses Americans had invested in. The seizure in Cuba cost Sam and Accardo millions of dollars, but it represented only a fraction of the losses they sustained from investments in the Havana casinos. Those casinos were the golden lode whence the profits flowed into the Chicago mob's treasury and into the coffers of other crime families across the country. Those losses made Sam a bitter man when the subject of Cuba came up. I had been chilled by my father's outburst, but my silence was only temporary. So often I tried to have normal, average discussions with him and was always left with a sense of being invisible, of having nothing of significance to say, of being so boring to my father that he had to ignore me. For some reason, I really wanted his attention that day. I wasn't ready to be shunted aside and told to shut my mouth like I was a child who should be seen and not heard. If I couldn't talk about his business, maybe I would get his attention with something more provocative. Maybe he would listen and take his eyes off that magazine if I talked about Castro. I should have known better, I suppose, but I was starved for Sam's attention. I should mention that my father had never shown any appreciation for my choice in men. Whomever I went with, whoever I admired, even the men I had married, were all subjects of his derision. Perhaps there was one exception. the time I dated Anthony Tishy, a young lawyer Sam wanted me to marry and whom my sister Bonnie later married. Tishy was a protege of my father's, a man for whom he had big political plans when he worked as an aide to Sam's congressional puppet, former Representative Roland Libanati. My failure to marry Tishy was never forgotten. Sex was a forbidden subject in my father's presence. He had made that abundantly clear over the years, and as a result, I had for the most part kept my liaisons with men secret. Sometimes I slipped and spoke of the attraction some men held for me. Sam usually ignored my remarks, told me to shut up, or walked out of the room. Now here I was once again being ignored by him, longing for his attention, even if it was negative. It seemed to me that the ideal subject to draw some response would be Fidel Castro, the man who had caused him so many financial difficulties. How was I to know? How could I know that Sam had been involved in a plot with the CIA to murder Castro? It was beyond my wildest imaginings at the time. So it was in complete ignorance of the depths of Sam's hatred of Castro that I began remarking about what a handsome and virile man Castro was, how I was attracted to him, how if I wasn't married and a mother, I would have liked to have met and spent some time with him. The married daughters of crime bosses don't or shouldn't admire the physical and sexual attributes of men other than their husbands, certainly not in the presence of their fathers. They are supposed to be decorative and obedient and to become dutiful wives to Italian stallions approved by Papa. On all counts, I had failed to conform, and my outspoken admiration for Castro was typical of the nonconformist acts I was known for. I expected a reaction, of course, but nothing like what followed. Suddenly, Sam leaped from his chair and almost instantaneously was at my side, ripping the paper from my hand and slapping my face. "Don't ever mention that bastard's name in this house again, ever!" he screamed. Sam was like a wild man. His face was flushed, almost beet red, and his arms flailed wildly in the air as, wheeling away from me, he paced up and down, mumbling in Italian, all the while scuffing his slippers on the floor as if he were kicking at some invisible enemy. "That son of a bitch, that syphilitic bastard, do you have any idea what he's done to me, to our friends?" he shouted. I shook my head in disbelief. I was actually frightened by his anger. I'd seen him angry before, but never this way. I was trembling now, not knowing what his next move would be or what I should do. The more he ranted about Castro, the angrier he got. He was almost in a frenzy as he screamed at me. His face was so flushed, I thought he was going to have a stroke. The veins in his neck and his forehead swelled and pulsed as he continued to shout at me, pounding on the table as he did so. "God damn it, Annette! You don't know anything about anything," he yelled. "I lose a bundle because of this bastard, and you're talking about him like he has some goddamn movie star. The hell are your brains? Get the hell out of here, Annette. Get out of here before I kill you." I knew enough at that moment to give my father no further argument. I just turned on my heel and hurried from the room. As I did, I could feel a cold sweat break out across my forehead. As I look back now, I think I had come very close to being killed, daughter or no daughter. It wasn't until 14 years later, when Sam was subpoenaed by Senator Church to testify with John Roselli, that I began to see how much he had been involved in the plot to kill Castro. 21 years later, I read an FBI document dated October 18th, 1960, that finally revealed how deeply he had been enmeshed in the international intrigue. All right, I'll read this, but it looks a little bit like it presents better on paper than in verse. Airtel to Saks, New York, Chicago, Miami enclosures, from Director FBI, subject anti-Castro activities, internal security, Cuba. There's a blanked out word. Airtel 101460, caption, Samuel M. Giancana, a.k.a. Top Hoodlum, AR copy enclosed for Miami. New York and Chicago should closely follow this matter and should immediately advise Bureau if any additional data is received regarding alleged plot against Castro. In particular, if information should be received indicating that Giancana plans to travel to Miami area or other trips, which could be to contact individuals implicated in alleged plot. Bureau and interested offices should be expeditiously advised, and recommendations should be furnished concerning close coverage of Giancana with view to identify any contacts he might make regarding this matter, including physical surveillance. Chicago should promptly advise if it has received any information indicating recent travel on Giancana's part to Miami or other areas, such as Mexico, which might indicate possible contacts with anti-Castro elements. Chicago should also review appropriate records to determine if Giancana has recently made any long-distance phone calls to persons who might be involved in the alleged plot against Castro. Miami should immediately furnish its comments regarding possible identity of person who allegedly met with Giancana at boat docked at Fontainebleau Hotel, Miami Beach. However, any inquiries conducted concerning this matter by Miami should be discreet so as not to jeopardize, identity censored, or alert individuals possibly involved in the Bureau's interest. Future correspondence concerning alleged plot against Castro should be submitted under instant caption. And that's the end of the FBI thing. How had my father reached such a position in the underworld where the CIA was negotiating clandestinely with him through intermediaries to plot the murder of Castro, while keeping the FBI, the U.S. Department of Justice, and even President of the United States John F. Kennedy in the dark? Had that plot and the resulting publicity led to my father's assassination? And was it the underworld or a government-hired assassin who killed Sam Giancana in the basement of our home? To find some of those answers, I've had to look back at both my life and that of my father and piece together not only his life of crime, but mine as a mafia boss's daughter. I've had to read thousands of pages of government documents, and I'm still fighting to gain access to others the government has withheld from me. And even as I write this with my co-author, I'm learning about my father, with whom I lived and who I watched later placed in the family mausoleum. I am learning and realizing that unlike most daughters, I never really knew my father, never understood him, until now. That's the end of chapter 1.